My name is Warren Mabey, and I am the Director of the School of Policy Studies, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the room. I want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples, and we're grateful for the opportunity to live and to work and to study on these grounds. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'm going to just give you a little bit of a rundown on a few upcoming events, which I hope that you'll keep in mind. First of all, next week, we have Bob Ray coming in to talk to us a little bit about minority governments. And as you know, Bob is both the former leader of the Federal Liberal Party and the former Premier of the province of Ontario. On Thursday, we have Marie-Claude Arguin, who's going to speak to us on Thursday, November 21st, about Lac Mégantic and some of the issues around the tragedy of the train wreck and the explosion and the fire in Lac Mégantic. As a former city manager, she has a really good insight into the things that happen there. And then finally, the last event for the fall term, on November 29th, we have the Tom Cruikshank Distinguished Lecture featuring the Right Honourable Paul Martin, former Prime Minister of Canada, who's going to speak a little bit about Indigenous education and Indigenous reconciliation, which has been the real kind of focus of his work post-Prime Minister life. So having said that, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. And today's speaker is Wilhelm Rinas, who is a graduate of our program, an alumni of our program. He is going to talk a little bit about his experiences in the public sector and most recently as the Director of Legal Services, Procurement and Insurance Group with the Ontario Clean Water Agency. And I know Wilhelm's got a whole vast range of experience to share with us, and we'll talk a little bit about how the Ontario Clean Water Agency has kind of evolved and the role that it plays here in the province. So please join me in welcoming Wilhelm.
Thank you. I'm just trying this out. Is my voice loud enough? Okay, I think it works. Okay, as Warren has said, I'm the Director of Legal Services, Procurement and Insurance at the Ontario Clean Water Agency. I've been there for about 18 years, not in that role, but in different roles. But maybe before I start getting into talking about the Ontario Clean Water Agency, I'll just talk a little bit about my career since I left here in 1986. So in 1986, when I was here graduating, I had visions of working for the federal government in federal-provincial relations. That was the topic of the day. I had professors like Professor Watts and Leslie. Professor Leslie was here. And so that was where I was going. But it didn't really end up that way, and I think that's important for you as students in particular. As you look at your careers, you're heading out into careers shortly. Things don't always go as you think, but there can be a lot of good in the changes that you'll encounter. So in 1986, that was my plan. I graduated, couldn't find any work. So I started looking in different areas. And the interesting thing was, in my undergrad at the University of Ottawa, I'd taken a course in political studies, one in particular, local politics, local government. But I never really liked local government. I always thought it was boring, it wasn't that interesting, federal-provincial relation, the Constitution, that's where it was at. But I took that one course. And then when I was at Queen's back in 1985-86, I took another course in local government. And the professor at the time, an expert, Thomas Plunkett, I think you have the lecture, something he's recognized here. He taught that course. And it was a good course because it talked about how a municipality is structured. It talked about budgeting. Again, but it wasn't that interesting, but I took it. I thought, okay, it's good to have. And then life moved on, and then 86, 87 came around, and I'm looking for work. Couldn't find it in the federal level or the provincial level. So I started looking at the local level. And it's interesting, to this day, I'm still in local government indirectly. The skills that I learned here, and I think this is what I wanted to bring to you today from your program, the key skills would be writing, communication, doing memos, and taking large bits of information and consolidating down into issues that are short and concise. The one thing I've learned over the last, I guess, 30 years, Nobody wants to read long papers, whether it's on the legal side, which I'm involved with now, or whether it's in briefing notes. Any briefing note that I would do now would be no longer than 1.5 pages. No one will read more. So that was a key skill set. The other thing, my course in local government has really helped me since then. We also had a course back in the 80s, I don't know if you have it now. It was about budgeting in government and understanding zero-based budgeting, understanding how government spends money and how it brings in revenues, just to understand how that works. That was helpful. And there was one other course. It was taught by a Professor Letterman. I'm not sure if any of you know who he is now, but he was a well-known lawyer, professor who dealt with federal provincial issues too. And he taught a course called Public Law, and I really enjoyed that, and that was maybe one of the reasons I decided to go back to law school later on. So I did get a good skill set, and I think that skill set, I've used that to this day. So when I started off in my first job, I was in regional government. I was there for 6 years. I was in a department called Economic Development. And that's where I started using the skills that I had learned here, the writing, learning how government works, learning how politicians interact with the people. And being a newbie at that time, a couple little anecdotes I remember is going to one session, and we were doing some kind of presentation to the public, or there was some committee work, and I remember one of these mayors came running up to me and he said, "Why am I here?" And I was totally baffled. But I now understand when people are really busy, and if you work with politicians down the line, you have to be ready to help them. So I had to basically give him a quick update of why he was here, and then he was happy and moved on. The other little anecdote, I remember when I started doing writing reports for regional council, and I had my way of doing it that I'd learned here, how to write memos. Another thing I learned, my memos, my director at the time would look at them and say, no, that's not right. He never liked my writing. I thought, this is crazy. I've been writing all these papers, my undergrad. I wrote papers, my master's, and I can't seem to get it right. And so what I did is I went back to one of the papers he had written, and I copied it basically word for word. I used all the same types of words, and it was a perfect paper. From then on, he loved my work, which was really his work. But what I really learned was you have to basically adjust for the situation, whether you're with politicians, when you're writing, you have to help deflect, help them interpret things, and give advice. So that was kind of in my years at the region. And at that time, I also did some work where I used to travel overseas. My job was to facilitate investment into Hamilton. And I enjoyed that. I got to travel a lot. But I wanted to be part of the deal, not just facilitate deals, and so that's why I went back to law school. So I went back in the 90s and graduated and came out, never thinking about the environment or water. I was more focused on business law, and maybe again, Ottawa beckoned a little bit. And again, things change. So when I came out, I was in the private sector. I worked for banking, TD Bank. And then an opportunity came up at the Ontario Clean Water Agency. And I remember looking at it, and I looked at the word water. And I thought, that's interesting. And here I am, 19 years later. What is this? The skill sets, when I look back now, my career, what I think has helped me in my job as a lawyer at, I know this, not lawyers, but is my understanding of government, which I got through my undergrads, and the practice. So you understand how laws work, you understand how people work, you understand how politicians work. You pull that all together, and you're a good candidate for a Crown agency, because you understand both sectors. So what I thought I'd do today is talk to you a little bit about the Ontario Clean Water Agency, why it was formed, how it works, and what it does, and I'll talk a little bit about the tensions between being a Crown agency working in the water services sector in Ontario. So what I've done, I've broken my presentation down into basically 5 parts. As I just mentioned, I'll say what is the Ontario Clean Water Agency, how was it established, how it operates, and how it operates as a business in the water services market. What is the Ontario Clean Water Agency? I have one former colleague over there who's very familiar with Aqua. He can correct me if I make any mistakes. But I'm not sure if any of you have heard of Aqua. Has anyone heard of Aqua? We've got a few people, okay. We're a Crown agency. What does that mean? I'll get into that a little bit later, but let's just give you the stats. Our annual revenues are $200 million a year. Not too shabby. We have 850 employees. We have over 180 municipal clients. If you look at this map here, you will see the dots. Those are our contracts all across the province. So we stretch from the south right down close to Windsor, Amherstburg area, all the way up around the Ottawa area, all the way up to the Manitoba border. Those are our clients. And if you can see from the bullets there, we're the largest water and wastewater operator in Canada. Actually, I would say also the United States, North America. We serve 4.5 million Canadians. So we treat the water and the wastewater. So when you're drinking water in many of these communities, 180 communities, my company has treated it. We have a hub and spoke network. What that means is we have 10 different regions where we have employees. It's like a hub. Think of a wheel with spokes. And we have contracts around that where we have staff. And that's how we manage our contracts. We manage more than $20 billion in municipal infrastructure. This is a very important issue today because a lot of the infrastructure has to be upgraded, not just in Canada, but around the world. And so everybody is concerned about infrastructure. And then you have the impact of global warming, and that's also having a huge impact on the infrastructure. We also have emergency response teams that can spring into action very quickly. And usually it's for small communities. We can go there and we can provide water and wastewater treatment services. And we've done so with respect to First Nation communities or other communities we've provided help. In particular, I'm thinking Minden Hills and a number of other communities. Before I get into our act that creates us, I'll talk just a little bit more. So we are a company. We're part of the government, but we are a company. We have a president. We have a board of directors. We have an HR department, finance department, legal department. We buy things up to $60 million a year of services. So we're run like a company. We have a contract from operating a trailer park to the region of Peel, which is Caledon, Brampton, and Mississauga, which are 1.2 million people. That's the breadth of our contracts. So what are agencies? When I first looked at Aqua to work for Aqua, I wondered, what is this agency business all about? What does that really mean? Well, what it is, the government will create agencies to deliver government programs in a manner that's not possible through direct government action. So the second point, it has operational flexibility. However, government will have certain directives where they still have control over us. So they create us, they establish us under an act, but then they put controls on us through finance and through the directives. And I'll get into that more. Directives are intended to deal with management of the agency and organizations. However, they do not exert control of the area of responsibility of the agency or a day-to-day business. There's different types of agencies, but we are an operational agency because we provide a direct service to the public. Okay, how was Aqua established? Maybe I'll go back a little bit in history, and this is before my time and going back quite a ways. Water and wastewater infrastructure at that time, because of the cost, was built by the province. Sometimes when you drive around Ontario, you may see signs, Ontario Water Resources Commission, maybe you've seen that. That would be the origins of Aqua. So that was the arm of the government. They set up this commission, this body, to basically finance the building of water and wastewater infrastructure across the province. That lasted till about up to the early 1970s. In the early 1970s, I think maybe 73, 74, the provincial government created the first Ministry of the Environment. Up till then, there was no Ministry of the Environment. And the Ontario Water Resources Commission was rolled into the Ministry of the Environment. And then things went along, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. But by that time, the government was recognizing there's a tension inside the government, inside the ministry, when you have one part of the ministry setting up the rules for water and wastewater treatment and how plants should be financed and operated, and the same ministry having staff running the plants. So what happens if there's something wrong, the way they're operating, you have the same ministry involved. So there's that tension and conflict. You can't have that. So around 1993, I heard someone mentioning that Bob Ray is doing a presentation on government. During the Ray years, I think he was 90 to 95, in 1993 they decided to take this operational arm of the ministry and create a company from it. And so what I want to talk about now is get into the act that creates us or establishes us, and then I'll get into how government still controls us, the government aspect. So this act, the Capital Investment Plan Act of 1993, established Aqua. So when you hear, a lot of times you hear about companies being incorporated, we're not incorporated, we're established by statute. That always confuses people because instead of saying the date we're incorporated and the name of the statute, under laws of Ontario, I have always write in the name CIPA, or Capital Investment Plan Act. So this is Section 2.1, Establishment of the Ontario Clean Water Agency. That's like our birth certificate. That's when we're born. It says clearly in the Act that we're a Crown agency. It also says very clearly the Ministry of the Environment is responsible for us. What does that mean? That means that we report to the Ministry of the Environment. When the Minister of the Environment stands up in Queen's Park, he also represents us. So he's very concerned about what we do. We don't want to embarrass him, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Fourth bullet, the Ontario Clean Water Agency has the capacity and the rights, powers, and privileges of a material person subject to limitations in the Act. This allows us to operate like a business. This allows us, these are what we call the natural person powers. This allows us to do things. So I, as a lawyer, or even as a person working for Aqua, will always look to our statute. What can we do? What can't we do? How broad is our scope? Before I get into the scope more, I'll just talk about the Act also sets out the organization of the board. We have a board, and the board of directors pass bylaws just like in a company. In our case, we have many bylaws where most companies might only have two. One that sets up the organization, who does what, and maybe one dealing with finance. For whatever reason, Aqua has about 18 bylaws. It's more accountable, we have more bylaws as a result. And this section 6, subparagraph 4, all borrowing, financing, and short-term investment of funds shall be coordinated by the Ontario Financing Authority. So this is where the government controls us. So whenever I want to borrow money, whenever I want to invest money, I have to go back to the Ontario Financing Authority, which, by the way, was also created by this Act, and get their approval. And that has a whole process. So that's how we're accountable. These are the key provisions. And what's interesting, I've been working, I said, for Aqua for many years, but we still go back to these provisions on a regular basis when we're trying to look at what we do, can we do it, is it within our objects, is it within our powers. So you look at it here, assisting municipalities, the Government of Ontario, and other persons to provide water and wastewater services. I'll just read it quickly. Financing and promoting the development, testing of new technologies, carrying out the activities described in A and B, and carrying out the policies of the Government of Ontario for land use and settlement. D, really, we don't talk about very much, it doesn't come up. It's really, number one is our bread and butter, and B and C, these are the things that we look at. B now more so as we develop as a company into the future, we're looking at new technologies. Everybody wants to know how can we make things better, and I'll get into that a little bit also in terms of what can we do with, let's say, green bin waste or organic waste. Can we create energy from that? Can we take these projects and put something back into the environment? So these points are something, it's amazing. You read it, and you read it again, and you read it again. You're always looking into that to see, can you spread that a little bit? How broad is that wording to help us go into new areas? So these are our powers, just like a business. These are our powers. Our powers are to make agreements for the provision of water and wastewater, and that's what we do. B, we don't expropriate and use any land. So some of these provisions have kind of become obsolete. But C, basically A and C are the provisions that we use on a regular basis. So basically, from my point of view, those are the most important provisions, the most important document for me to pay attention to, is the Act that creates us and tells us what we can do. So I'm ready to go now as a corporation, do all these different things. But now this is where the government comes in and says, well, wait a second, now we're going to have a memorandum of understanding with you, which is going to tell you how we're going to work together and how Big Brother is going to keep an eye on you. And so I'm not sure if you in your studies yet have looked at any memorandums of understanding. I'm not sure, Warren, have they done that or looked at some of that? Or maybe. So a lot of these ministries will have an MOU with their agencies describing the relationship, who does what. So the MOU establishes the relationship between the Minister of the Environment and Aqua. It also establishes the level and degree of the government's involvement. It establishes the agency's accountability. So that's kind of the high level. Again, one of these MOU documents, and this is where a lot of times when people talk to me about policy and how is policy related, if you're involved in a policy type role at the Ministry of Environment, you'd be involved in this, in helping to draft one of these or review it. And your research skills would be involved, not so much in this first part, because this is just saying some standard information, but it'd be more in how we will work, how Aqua will work, how this agency will work, what services we'll be providing, and do what is the services we're trying to provide. Perhaps we have a new idea. Does it fit within the model? So this MOU will have a highlight. It might be, I think it's about 20 pages long. It'll describe the mandate and powers of Aqua. I always refer to Aqua, sorry, as abbreviation. How we will operate in accordance with the Act, which is SIPA, so you can see the interrelation, and the types of services we can provide. If you looked at the statute, which I just showed you, it was kind of brief. It had one provision that talked about the services. If you look at the MOU, it's a couple pages long, so it gets into more detail. The guiding principles. So in the relationship between us and the Ministry of the Environment, there's some guiding principles that they want us to adhere to. And so they'll talk about general policy direction. They'll basically say you're independent, because they don't want to deal with us on a day-to-day basis. We have freedom for that. But there is a check and balance, and we'll talk about that. They'll give us management principles. Basically, they want ethical behavior, transparency, high-quality service to the public. Then there's a whole list of government directives, and that's about 2 pages too. So that is where Aqua, so we are this company, but we are a Crown agency, so we have to pay attention and follow directives. And again, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the term directives, but these are how agencies are supposed to operate. So the most important one for us there probably is the Procurement Directive. And so when we purchase goods and services on behalf of the agency, we have to follow government procurement rules. And again, I'm not sure if you're familiar at all about procurement, whether you studied that, but if you do, you understand that's a whole separate area, but very important in government that it's transparent. So that's a very important directive for us. Freedom of information and privacy, you probably have all heard about that. We get requests for freedom of information on a regular basis, but we can turn them down or say we should be excluded if it's proprietary. So that's something we now have as a Crown agency operating like a business. We can say that's proprietary, you can't see that, and that's accepted. But we have to follow the general rules. And the Travel, Meal, and Hospitality Expense Directive, that's also an important one in government, because in the past there have been some issues, and so this is a very tight directive on how we can spend money. So even though we're a business, we can't hold big parties, we can't I think it's $40 a day or $45 a day for expenses. We have to account for them. There's very specific rules. And that's a government control mechanism to prevent abuse. Then there's the accountability framework. So our president will basically have a conference call with the Deputy Minister of the Environment every 2 weeks to update him on how things are going. That's the control mechanism. And he meets or talks on the phone. The chair of Aqua's board, he talks to the deputy minister, I think the president talks to the chair once a week. So the president is responsible to the chair, but he's also responsible to the deputy minister, and sometimes he's called into a meeting with the minister himself. That's much more difficult due to time. So this accountability framework, this is would be set up by the policy people at Ministry of Environment. They would have sat down and figured out exactly how the relationship is going to work. So even though you have the statute, SIPA, which says, okay, Aqua is this agency, can do all these different things, it's very general and high level, and the government sits down and says, okay, now exactly what do we want these guys to do? And how can we control them? To a certain point only. The CEO is accountable to the board for the operation and management of the agency. The one thing to be aware, and again, this is where the government, in a crown agency type relationship, the government appoints all the board members and it appoints the president. These are for terms of 3 years. So they're appointments. And there's a whole process to get on the list to be an appointee. Another way they can control the operation of the agency is through business plans, annual reports, and financial reporting. So our financials, our $200 million in sales, all of that rolls up into the ministry's budget. So whatever their expenses are, they roll us into. So it's very important that we're in the black, not in the red. And so that's important. And I'll talk a little bit, actually maybe now's the time I can explain that one. So as a crown agency, our job is not to make a huge profit because we're a government entity created to provide services. So we try to do cost recovery plus a little bit. So we don't want to be making $20 million profit on 200. Maybe if you make a profit under $3 or $4 million, that is cost recovery with a little bit extra to cover our expenses. Audit requirements. The agency is audited by the Auditor General of Ontario. This is another way they do the checks and balances. Every year, early January, the Auditor General staff will come into our offices at One Yonge. They'll park themselves in one of the boardrooms, and they're there for about 2 months where they check and check all of our accounting to make sure everything's being done right. And then we get a report if we did well or not, or where there's room for improvement. That's every year. All our financial arrangements. Now again, you saw originally we have this personal powers that we can run like a business. We saw that in the Act, but then let's go back to that MOU, which guides us on how we're going to actually work with the ministry. They want us to confirm what we do. On a daily basis, we don't have to talk to them, but when it comes to borrowing large amounts of money or investing, we have to get approval. This chart here maybe is an easy example or a good example of showing you how everything is set out in terms of governance. You have our president right here, Nevin McEwen, as the chief executive officer. Above him, you have the board of directors. Above him, you have the chair. The chair, you can see the line of responsibility goes straight to the Ministry of Environment. Yet there's also the contact with the Deputy Minister of Environment. And above him is the cabinet. So I decided to now do a bit of a recap, so I want you at least after the end of my little presentation, you'll know about SIPA, and you'll know about our MOU, and you'll know about government priorities. So again, this is a bit of repetition, but we're going back to 1993, so we're about 25 years old now. We're a public body. We have 3 different unions in our company. We have this MOU with the Ministry of the Environment. We get an annual mandate letter from the government. It doesn't always work out that way, but the idea is supposed to be annual. That basically highlights the government priorities and how we fit into those. We have to go to the OFA, or Ontario Financing Authority, for review of our finances. And this kind of a side point, we have this special agreement, a special provision in the collective agreement. Because we're dealing with water and wastewater, our staff are protected and we can provide emergency services. They call it an essential services agreement. So we can operate a plant. If there was a strike somewhere, we could actually operate because it's an essential service. Water you have to have. So that's a little exception for us. In addition, this is maybe the key point. A lot of people get confused and they think, oh, well, you're just another taxpayer-funded entity and you're costing us money. That's not true. So the original money to set us up was seed money. That goes back to 1993. But since 1993, we've received no money at all from the government. All of our revenues are through contracts, where we compete like any other business for contracts. People don't get that part. So our company will rise or fall depending how successful we are at providing services. And so if we lose contracts in an area, then we have to surplus people. We can't just say, oh, we'll keep you anyway. No, we're run like a business in that respect. I mentioned before, Aqua is highly accountable, and we talk about the agencies and the ministry. Okay, now I'll talk a little bit about how we operate as a business in the water services market. So what we've done, so now you know we have this act out there that creates us kind of a bare bones. We can do all these different things. We can provide water services. And the MOU that tells us how we're supposed to operate, be accountable. Now what do we do with all that? So we came up with this plan. We call ourselves our value proposition. And you may hear that a lot as more as a business term. What do we provide to the consumer? What do we provide to municipalities? And we're saying our value proposition to municipal clients is we're a total solutions provider. We offer a complete range of water services, and I'll get into that a little bit more. We're an emergency responder, and we operate in the public interest, including as an essential service. We put now again, I'm trying to give you an idea. We got the SIPA, we have the MOU, how we put that all together and operate. If you look at this is our mandate. Okay, you'll see we were founded 1993. Our vision, trusted world leader in water. Our mission to demonstrate service excellence. Then our mandate can be broken into 3 primary areas. Basically, our bread and butter, assist municipalities. 2, finance and promote development of technologies, because that is now the future. And 3, act as an emergency responder. So government can call us. There's a special provision in the Safe Drinking Water Act where they can call us up and they can say, please go and deal with a situation anywhere in the province of Ontario. And they have done that. But a lot of times, by the time we got up and ready to go and dressed and have the boots ready to go, the problem was dissipated and it wasn't required, but we're ready to go at any time. So what is a total water solutions provider? So this is where we do our marketing. This is where we're acting like a business. So now we're saying, okay, how can we make money? How can we provide all these services, be a do-gooder in the government sense, but still make enough money to pay our salaries, pay the increases, grow the company? Where do we invest? But we go back to what we are. We do operation and maintenance. We can do planning services, financial planning. We'll look at a municipality's infrastructure, and we'll review it, and we'll say, you know what, over the next 10 years, you have to make all these changes, or your system is not going to work anymore. It'll fall into disrepair. So we have engineers and qualified staff. We do asset planning and asset management, and you may have heard these are key words now in government. Reviewing your asset, because these things cost a lot of money, they've got to be paid for. That takes time. We have an engineering and capital delivery group of about 20 people. We provide training services. We can train other municipalities or other entities that require water operators. And utility management, that deals with water, wastewater, they're called utilities. We try to manage, and we show different entities how to manage municipal facilities. So that's our code word, total solutions provider. We can do all these things with water. We want one-stop shopping for our clients. And then we align with provincial priorities. So basically, these are very high level. You know, we're talking about global warming. We talk about the asset management of their systems. We talk about carbon reduction and reducing greenhouse gases. These are very high level, waste diversion. So I'll skip over that a little bit now. Maximize the asset life. Advance the state of clean drinking water in First Nation communities. So about 7-8 years ago, there was a big funding push from the federal government to help First Nations, because a lot of them are on boil water advisories. And so during, I guess it was, it would be around 2010, Omari, do you remember? Around that period of time, we were in about 30 First Nation communities all across northern Ontario, helping them, training them as operators, because a lot of them don't have operators or they're very small, to help them with their water, to try to prevent the boil water advisories. So we have an ongoing relationship there to work with the federal government to help First Nations. We have an emergency response team. You know, they have outfits, they're dressed, we have trailers, 2 of them across the province where we can respond. And as I was saying before, we're getting into new technologies, how to improve the process, change the chemicals maybe that we're using in drinking water processing, and wastewater processing, all to make things more efficient. You know, when I first started in the water business, it seemed fairly simple. But as you get more and more into it, you realize it can become very complex. For example, and this is from the energy side, we can now monitor all the power usage of a water plant or wastewater plant, and then we can decide what times during the night do you want to pump water or not on a water plant. So that can save energy depending on the cost of electricity. You can be much more efficient with your energy costs. And so all of these different factors, what I call the big data now, we can take big data and use it to run plants better. So there's always new areas growing and evolving even in our business. We must compete. So here's another thing which is unusual. People think Crown Agency, you're just, you get your money from the government, you're just out there making money or draining the taxpayer. Well, we're not. We have to fight for our contracts. So we go to RFP, we compete. We have two major competitors. One company is called Veolia, which is a company out of France. And there's another company called American Water, and I think it's gone through a number of different permutations. Those would be probably our two biggest competitors. And they're trying to get a foothold in Ontario. And there's sometimes regional or localized engineering companies that can also run a water plant. As long as they have a number of engineers, they could do it, or they could specialize in it. And now also certain municipalities are aggregating facilities from a number of communities, and they're becoming potential competitors too. So we compete for our contracts. We have to sharpen our pencil, and we put bids in to win the contract. Sometimes we're successful, sometimes we're not. Sometimes we operate for 10, 15 years in a community, then we lose it in a competitive bid, and then we're out for 5 years, then we come back again. So we're in a competitive environment. And we're constantly trying to basically plan to try to be in 10 years, we were trying to be at 350 million in revenues. We're over 200 now, we got about 7, 8 years to go, but we're constantly growing. But this takes a lot of time, strategic planning, is involved in all this. So I know my timing is not too bad. Okay, so here's a question. Now you're probably looking at me and going, okay, he's a lawyer, water and wastewater, how does policy analysis fit into all of this? And what my opinion has always been, and where you're sitting right now, you guys have to be open-minded about the jobs you're going into, because you may not find something that says policy analyst. My view is you should have business, you should have government experience, and you should be flexible. And so in my particular company, we have about 100 people at head office, and then we have people out in the regions. People have knowledge of environmental studies. People may have some business background. So we have people in marketing, communications. All these people could potentially be people from a program like yourself. But the key thing is be flexible and realize policy analyst is one function, but the skill set you have, you can transfer it. So mix it, be open to mixing it with business. It doesn't hurt to have business knowledge because the understanding debits, credits, understanding how money is made, cost recovery, understanding these terms, it's only a good thing. And I'm a big proponent of that. And be open-minded. Like I said, I started off like you, in policy analyst, and I thought I'd be in federal provincial relations in Ottawa, and I ended up being a lawyer at a Crown agency focused on making money and keeping us out of trouble in a totally different world, but understanding, using the skills I learned in the different programs. And so yeah, that's kind of my presentation. I'm open for questions. Oh, okay, sure.
Yeah, so kind of regarding the hierarchy.
Yes.
The CEO, the board of directors, do they have a direct financial stake in the success of Aqua, as I'm sure?
Not the board. The board, no, because it's basically a volunteer. Okay, they're not making money. They get a day per diem when they show up for meetings, so they're not making money. So it's not a financial stake, it's more of a prestige. So to be on our board would be more of a prestige thing. The president, would have, I guess, he can get a raise, I guess, but he doesn't have a personal, no shares. There's no shares in our company. The Ontario government is the entire shareholder of the entire company. Yeah. Sorry, next. Yeah.
Make these things so hard now. There we go.
Sure.
So if you guys are competing for business, who are your main competitors and what is your competitive differentiators?
Okay, so first of all, our main competitors, as I mentioned to you, is a company called Veolia, and there's another one, I think they used to be called American Water. There's another name, they've changed it again. And also the municipality themselves. Sometimes the municipality will take it back and they will look at the comparative process as a ways to compare. And they'll be able to see what the numbers are like. What is our special advantage? We're the province of Ontario. So some communities like the idea of thinking, wow, we have the province of Ontario working for us. Now that province of Ontario, you think about, we're a Crown agency and they don't care about that part, but they feel confident they have the province of Ontario working for them. Who better than the province? Okay, but then of course we have these other roles and liability and indemnity and all of that. But that's our biggest advantage. And we're the largest independent water service provider in Ontario, and we've been doing it for 25 years. So those are our strengths. We can always highlight Peel, which is our largest contract. We can talk about trailer parks, and we have credibility. We're probably the strongest in the north, in the smaller communities. We're very strong actually in this area here. We used to run Kingston years ago. And then as we head down into southern Ontario, we're kind of sprinkled. We don't run Ottawa, we don't run Hamilton. We run wastewater for Waterloo, we run City of Kawartha Lakes. The big cities like City of Toronto, of course we'd love to run City of Toronto, but they are big enough on their own, they can handle it, and they're huge, right? Like I think their water and wastewater department is probably bigger than the ministries. Like that's how big they are, right? But that's our main point. And then the total solutions provider. So we can say we have over 500 operators, so we can move people around. And that's hard to find operator jobs nowadays because people are not that interested. It's changing now. People are more interested perhaps than maybe 5 years ago. Maybe it's because the wages are lower, but the wages are going up a little bit, but those are our strengths. Our history, the big contracts, people know us. But that doesn't mean the municipalities will sometimes just go for the bottom line. We will lose contracts just because our numbers weren't good enough. And then we try to fix that next time.
So even though your business model is not based on making large amounts of
yes.
profit,
Yep.
your price is still competitive to other competitors.
It is. Yep. You're right.
An advantage on that side.
No, it's not like we sell ourselves cheap. No.
Yeah.
No,
okay.
I don't want to say that.
We've got a good question on the Slido up there. The first one about what are some of the challenges when we're talking about First Nations or Indigenous communities, and how long is it going to take for these communities to have safe water? I think
Okay.
this is
Yeah, that's a really tough one. First of all, the challenge in planning distance and how to get access to some of these communities. Some of the communities you have to fly into, and that means you got to get a special flight. So flying in, access is a big one. Funding is another problem. And there's sometimes differences in views on the Fed. When the feds have money for that, they have to develop a program. The First Nations has to be involved. So I would say access to the site is a big problem. Secondly, a lot of times the First Nations don't have a lot of people you can train, or you have to bring them up. So you have to train people. So the training takes time. Funding is the big one. And the time element. It's one thing to go in there for 2, 3, 4 weeks, a year, but maybe you have to be there over 3 years. Maybe you have to provide a consulting service, which we've done by phone, or people drive in, but some of these distances are massive. As an example, we have 10 regions. One of our biggest regions, which would be, if you know the map of Ontario in your head, it's the piece closest to Manitoba. The manager's region is the size of France. So just imagine that. So our operators can drive sometimes 4 to 5 hours to one plant to do something and then go home. That's their day. 4 to 5 hours, just driving. And then you got to worry about them getting hit by moose or the weather conditions and all of that too. I was out in one area one time, we had some problems in the plant, and I got snowed in. I think I was up near, and I think it was the Greenstone area of Ontario. The one thing I did learn in this job, all these little communities I had never heard of, I now was visiting. There might be 1,000 people there, or 2,000, you go to one store and you keep running into everybody because that's the only store. But going back, so access, funding, time, location, those are the big issues. How long will it take for the Northern FN folks or First Nation, was that back there again? To have safe drinking water? I think I'll finish that question off.
Yeah.
That's a tough one. Also the sources of water, what is the source like? Is it contaminated, is it not? I think the biggest issue is probably resources and time. And so you have to be committed. You can't just go in there and out, and it doesn't work that way. It takes time. Next one.
I think we have another question on the floor, so I'll go here.
Thank you for your presentation. Can you talk a little bit about what the tragedy in Walkerton did to change your business?
Sure. That's actually really interesting because when I had this opportunity at Aqua, I looked at it in 1999, and then I was hired on in 2000. I was oblivious to everything with water. It was all new to me. And then within 5 months, Walkerton happened. And I was the guy they sent out there, and they said, okay, your job is to look through all the documentation. And so I was in the basement of that water treatment facility, photocopying letters, documents, and all that. I was there for a week. And that really brought home this whole idea of why water is important to me and to a lot of people at the time. And now it's already 19 years have gone by. A lot of our new operators haven't even heard of it, or it's a vague recollection of hearing about it. 7 people died. It was a small community, I think about 5,000 people. So what they did after that, the government set up a study. I think the judge's name was O'Connor, Dennis O'Connor, and he came up with many recommendations. What had happened was E. coli had gotten into the water. The operators were not, did not have a proper skill set, I would say, and to understand the impact of that. And so in the recommendations of the O'Connor report, I think there were over 50, they dealt with all the different ways one could treat water and basically have the checks and balances. So that was 2000, it started after, so 2000 was Walkerton. And later on, because I was familiar now with Aqua operations, I moved to the Ministry of the Environment in 2000, late 2001, and stayed there till 2003. And during that time, I had the lucky opportunity to work on the drafting of the Safe Drinking Water Act. And again, now I was involved again with the policy people and with stakeholders and all these meetings to draft an act that would deal with, to avoid a Walkerton happening again. And so we went into detail into training of the operators. We went into more inspections. And I can tell you the inspections of a water plant are very good. They're very detailed. And you have to get a high score to have any meaning. So those are the key things that came out of Walkerton: more inspections, better training, ongoing review of our water plants. So we should be comfortable that when you're turning on the tap in Ontario, that the water you're getting has been tested, the proper lab results, proper sampling, an operator who is skilled has looked at it. I've been actually in the Ukraine on personal matters in the last 2 years. I've been there twice, and we forget. For us, we take it so for granted. We turn the tap, we drink. We don't even think twice. But nobody does that in the Ukraine or in Russia or Romania, or I don't think even in Poland. And I have a colleague in the Ukraine, he says to me, yeah, I remember when I was young, I would drink water from the tap. Like, it doesn't even make sense to us. Like, I'm going now, I drink from the tap, from the fountain. They don't do that. Everyone goes around carrying water bottles. Can you imagine the number of water bottles for a family? You're drinking nonstop out of plastic. So it had a huge impact. I think actually in the early 2000s, the government was almost too intense, but it was good because it got people on board to realize water is important. So an additional point there is that councils, municipal councils, have a new responsibility when it comes to their plants, to their water plants, that they take it serious, that they have good oversight over their operators, whether it's Aqua or someone else or their own staff, to make sure that their citizens are getting good treated water. But it's all about skill set, better sampling. Oh, the difference is now, if there is a problem with sample results, the sample result is called in to the local doctor of minister, they call the medical officer of health. That was the difference. It didn't happen in Walkerton. So the local medical officer of health was not getting that information. And he kept asking the plant, is everything okay? And they said, I guess they said it seems to be okay, or everything looks okay. But now the result from a lab, bad results with E. coli would go directly to the local medical officer of health right away that everybody knows. So the information now is out there. So unfortunately, 7 people died, and many people still have lingering health effects from drinking the bad water. And that's terrible. But it had a huge impact in Ontario. So I think our laws are a lot better. The problem, I guess, is we have so many different chemicals still in drugs that we take, medicine, and stuff going into our lakes that we can't get all of it. I think that's the problem. Can we get all of it? We're not sure. And if you think about it, it's the cycle of life. Everything we're drinking, it goes back into the river, it goes through our bodies, and we keep using the same water over and over again. You don't really think about that, but you get into our business, you think about it. So this cycle is going on nonstop. And if you think about that, then you realize how important it is. So
First, I want to take this one off of Slido, and then we're going to go. I know
Yeah.
there's one over here and one over here. There's the ongoing story about lead contamination in Ontario pipes, Ontario cities. Can you talk about the role of Aqua in that particular story?
yeah, I don't have information on that. I know that's just a recent story, like in the last 2 or 3 days, so I can't comment on that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then I'm going to go over here first, and
Sure.
then we'll come back. Okay.
So it's kind of, I guess, related to that in the way that there's also a developing story about lead contamination in Nova Scotia and how half the population might be drinking lead-contaminated water from wells. So I was just wondering if you could speak to the degree of kind of interprovincial consultation and how much work do you do with other kind of clean water agencies in other parts of Canada?
Okay, I've been in Aqua, like I said, for over 18 years. I have not had contact with other I think, one second, I shouldn't say that. I think when I was at the ministry, I might have had some brief contact, but from my perspective in legal, and I deal also with compliance, we have also a compliance group that studies regulations and how to treat water. I'm not aware of any consultation with another province. I think Ontario is probably the leader. I mean, maybe I'm pushing Ontario too much, but I would think we're probably the leader, and it probably has a lot to do with Walkerton because we really went full bore on developing a system that would work and that we would never have that problem again. So I would say we're probably the leader, and they probably would be coming to us to talk to us about how we're doing things. Yeah.
I'm just curious to understand who's responsible for some of the infrastructure. So you have the water treatment plant, and then you
Yes.
have the piping infrastructure.
Yes.
Is the province responsible? Is the municipality responsible? Where do you play into that?
Okay.
And sorry, just to be more specific,
Yep.
once it leaves the main pipe on the road and goes to the house, who's responsible for once it hits on the
Okay.
property line?
Okay, right. Okay, first of all, the province is not responsible. Aqua is responsible for operating, and depending on how the contract is worded, maybe the maintaining or fixing, repairing of pipes, because you can't really maintain a pipe in the ground, right? So usually it's fixing it when it bursts, or you can find out there's a leak. But usually the way it works is when the water goes from the road to your house, that's your problem. Yeah, and I've had that personally happen too. In fact, years ago in Hamilton, I did have a lead pipe. I guess it was also only I'm not sure what it was, 1 inch or 1.5 or whatever, from my house to the road, and I had to pay the cost of replacing that. So you're responsible from the road to the house.
Do people know that?
I would think they should know that. And sometimes they send out little circulars. Sometimes they provide some kind of grant or incentive for you to do different things. One of the reasons the municipalities have been more alert or spend more time on that, or even insurance companies, because there's been more flooding. And houses are getting flooded for whatever reason, maybe the climate change, these bigger storms. You know, we call them the 1 in a 100-year storm is coming maybe every year now in some areas. So there is more flooding, and so insurers are saying you should have backflow preventers, like it's this little valve that prevents backups from going onto your property. They're telling maybe insurance company, you've had too many floods, the insurance company is saying you better do something because we're not going to insure you anymore. Or you might get letters from the town saying, hey, we're not on the hook anymore, there's too many problems in your area for whatever reason. So that's kind of how that issue is being dealt with. It's becoming more popular.
Hello. I know that there's like a big concern right now about like pharmaceuticals going into like water sources. Can you speak to like the policy context about that, how you're involved in that, or how that's impacting Aqua?
I'm not involved on the pharmaceutical part. We try to treat, this would be more of a technical question. I can't tell you exactly where the issues are with the pharmaceuticals. I can tell you though that it's becoming more of a problem because more and more of these chemicals are going into our water systems. We still believe that by treating it the way we do with chlorine and the different processes we use, we're getting the worst out and the water is good to drink, no question about that. But I think it's only going to become more complicated. And so that's why there's a development of new technologies and new ways to try to assess, how to improve that water. And that's why we always have, we've had campaigns ourselves at Aqua, don't flush things down the toilet that are, people put the weirdest stuff down there. Like, come on, like it's not a garbage can, So we try to promote that. Even in the schools, we talk to the kids about that. So yeah, those are very technical questions, but I think the key thing to know is, from our experience as an Aqua operator, we're very comfortable when you open the tap, that water is good to drink. We're confident in it.
So we have time for one last question, and we're going to do it off of Slido. Why would a municipality not engage?
I can't think of any reason.
This also might not be within your
Sure,
purview,
yeah.
but I have read some research suggesting that like very low levels of lithium being added to water can be really beneficial in addressing like depression and mental illness on like a population level. Have you heard about this at all? Is that anywhere within the realm of possibility? And would you be
I haven't
involved in
heard
it?
that. No, I've never heard that.
Okay.
I've heard about the debates on fluoride. You heard all kinds of arguments about fluoride. Again, I'm not the right person, but I heard only about fluoride. Some people say it's good, but lithium, no, I haven't heard about it.
Lithium and cannabis, and we're covered.
Yeah.
So this is a good place, I think, for us to wrap up. I want to take this opportunity to thank Wilhelm because this has been a great talk and a lot of info.
Thanks. Thank you.